Hello again, and welcome to the 11th of our lectures in this series on the foundations of Western civilization. Now, in the last lecture, we talked about drama and about architecture as two of the great public arts of the polis, and in particular of the Athenian polis. I want to turn today to another of the public arts, to another of the public conversations that went on in these polis. I'm going to turn to history. Now, you may say that that seems a bit odd, a bit paradoxical. I mean, haven't we, after all, for the last 10 lectures, been doing history? Well, this way I suppose we have. What is history? Well, Voltaire once said, famously, that history is a bunch of lies the living tell about the dead. Henry Ford said history's bunk. The Greeks invented it, so what did they think it was? What is the point of history? Now, let's say right away, and I've made this point on 2 or 3 earlier occasions, as I hope you'll recall, that we can think of history as what happened in the past, and we can think of history as the way things are remembered, which in a certain sense means that the events of the past will take on new meanings, perhaps even change their meanings, as we reflect on them differently. That will be a useful thing to have in mind as we think about the Greeks and about what they thought history was. Now, let's be very clear. The Greeks did not invent historical mindedness. When I say that the Greeks invented history, I am saying that the Greeks invented a particular literary form that we know as history, or that we have come to know as history. When we talked about the Hebrews, for example, we saw that there was a powerful sense of historical mindedness among them. We also saw that its force was prophetic. You may recall my saying that to some degree, the Hebrews imagined a past as a way of charting a future. Now, we also saw, for example, among the Egyptians, a very powerful sense of historical mindedness. To take but one example, the recording of all of those dynasties of kings, one after another after another. You don't do that without a very powerful sense of historic mindedness. But for the Egyptians, this was a way of charting the authenticity and legitimacy of their pharaonic rulers. For the Hebrews, for example, unfolding history in this way was a way of revealing an unfolding relationship between a God and his people. And insofar as one party to that relationship, God himself, was rather beyond the realm of ordinary human experience, that made historical mindedness, or even history for the Hebrews, something rather different from what it would be for the Greeks. The Greeks were less interested, quite simply, in pointing toward the future. For the Greeks, history was a way of understanding now, and then in the second place, it was a way of understanding certain fundamental elements that mark each of us and all societies. There is a universalizing dimension. Now, we could say then that there are certain similarities between the Greek view of history and the Hebrew view of history, but that in some ways in the Greek view of history, the religious component is much diminished, perhaps indeed even absent. Now, to repeat, to say that the Greeks invented history is to say that they invented a particular literary form. Was this a good idea or a bad idea? Aristotle, in his Poetics, you may recall in the last lecture we mentioned Aristotle's Poetics in terms of the definition of tragedy. Well, Aristotle's great book of literary criticism, the first book of literary criticism as far as we know that was ever written, also addressed itself to history. Fundamentally, it's a book about poetry, although there is something interesting hiding in a word, yet again. The Greek verb poiein means to make. A poet is a maker. The creative act is to make poetry. Now, Aristotle says that poetry is a superior art to history because poets never lie and historians frequently do. Now, I haven't been lying to you over the last 10 lectures, but Aristotle's point is that the poets seek for deeper, more fundamental, more lasting, and more beautiful truths, and they adorn them in more elegant language. Historians merely haggle over details. They try to get down what happened. Well, I've often wondered if Aristotle possibly had his tongue in his cheek when he said that. I don't begrudge him that he likes poetry better than history. Sensible people have preferred poetry to history. But I'm not sure that historians only haggle over details, and I'm not sure that they don't, at least sometimes, try to tell the truth. The greatest Greek historians wrote down lots of details. Of this there can be no doubt. If you go to the library and you take one of these books off the shelf, or if you go to your local bookstore and you take one of these books off the shelf, Herodotus, Thucydides, they are big fat books. There's a lot of information in there. But the story is not finally about that information. The story is finally about certain large themes, about certain large truths, about the way human beings conduct themselves, about why they do what they do. What they do is important, yes, but why people did things is vastly more important. There is an element in Greek historical writing at its best that is epic. There is a sense of transposing the ordinary into the extraordinary, as it were, of painting a small picture but on a very large canvas, of universalizing, of saying, I see these events in this place at this time, but I can derive from them this large principle about the way human beings act. That is the goal, that is the aspiration of Greek historical writing, not merely to record. Now, we could agree or disagree with the points that they make, and that may be something of what Aristotle was driving at. In other words, not telling the truth is not so much falsifying, but not hitting the unquestionably universal in a way that he supposed poets did, and hitting the questionably universal as he thought historians might do. Well, enough of all this beating around the bush. Let's talk about some Greek historians. Herodotus, born probably 485 BC or thereabouts, right in the middle of the Persian Wars, dies in 425. He's usually called the father of history. He wrote one great book. A long, let me repeat that, a long, highly entertaining account of the Persian Wars. Now, he saw the Persian Wars, Herodotus did, as a great watershed moment in Greek history. He saw this as a kind of a defining moment in Greek history. In many ways, we could look back and say he was not wrong to do so. Herodotus was born in Ionia. He was born, in other words, on the western coast of Anatolia, on the opposite side of the Aegean Sea from the Greek mainland. This reminds us that large numbers of important Greeks came from various parts of the Greek world. I've been kind of stressing Athenian culture here, and that's legitimate, but not everything happened in Athens or was done by Athenians. We don't know a lot about Herodotus. He was very well educated, apparently. He was very widely read. He quotes Homer. He also quotes the poet Hesiod, a little bit younger contemporary of Homer who wrote important poetic works. What is, I think, most interesting and engaging about Herodotus, and what I would challenge you to do, or invite you to do perhaps, if you're wandering through a bookstore, wandering through a library, take Herodotus down off the shelf, open it randomly, and read 5 pages. You'll enjoy the 5 pages you just read. You won't have much of a sense of how the whole work works, but the point is that you'll enjoy those few pages. Herodotus is a wonderful storyteller, and he is voraciously curious. He's interested in everything. Now, there are times when we might wish he had spared us some of what he learned. But in any case, there is this wonderful sense of wonder at the world around him. Now, in order for him to explain the Persian Wars, Herodotus felt that it was essential that he inform himself of the necessary background. So he traveled very widely. He traveled in Egypt. He traveled in Mesopotamia. He traveled throughout the Persian Empire. He thought if the Greeks and the Persians are going to have this great war, he needs to know something about these people and the world they lived in. He traveled throughout the Greek world. He constantly interviewed people. He tells us again and again and again and again that he interviewed people. And he actually here is very honest about these things. He will say, when I was in a certain place, someone told me that. Or he'll say, everyone there believes that. This has sometimes been missed by people who read Herodotus. They think he's sort of credulous and believes everything. In fact, if you read him carefully, he's often saying people in that town believe that, as if, in other words, to distance himself, what he's now telling you. He's saying, this may not be true. This is what they told me, but it may not be true. So this is a very interesting, and I think actually, Aristotle to the contrary, a very honest component of his work. In the end, Herodotus said you can really rely most on what you've seen with your own eyes. That raised a very interesting question, and it is one that we will actually come back to a number of times in later lectures in this course. Is it possible to write the history of the remote past? It would for a very long time have been said no. Because this Greek notion that only what I have seen with my own eyes am I authorized to write about was very powerful and very influential. Well, if he wants to write about the Persian Wars, then you see, he had to travel through this world. He wasn't content merely to kind of know about it at second or third hand, or to read about it. Why did he write? Lots of people have been interested in things, lots of people have been engaged by things, lots of people have been fascinated in things over the years. What prompted him to write about the Persian Wars? Something struck him about those wars, and indeed it is something striking about those wars. The Persian Empire, the mightiest empire the world had known, was defeated by the Greeks. Now, if you're a betting person, and it were about the year 490 and the Persian Wars were about to unfold, and somebody said, all right, get down your bet, you'd bet on the Persians. Every sensible person would bet on the Persians. You'd have lost your bet, but that would have been the only smart bet to make. The Greeks won. The Greeks won. So Herodotus was fascinated by this. How is it possible? Now, we could say, couldn't one ask the question of how a bunch of haggling, quarreling, arguing colonists on the east coast of North America could, in the late 18th century, have defeated the British Empire? I dare say we can, and we have asked that question. Roll yourself back to 1776. Who would you bet on? Who would you bet on? You'd bet on the British. You'd lose, but that would be the smart bet. Anyway, Herodotus was fascinated in this business of how it was that the Greeks were able to defeat the Persians. Well, he figured this must have something to do with character. It must have something to do with fundamental underlying issues. Because on the face of it, the disparity in resources made it perfectly clear that the Greeks can't win, but they did. So, to understand character, he travels through the Persian Empire. He interviews people, he asks questions, he reads books, he visits sites. Goes all over the world. And he has in mind a number of things, but in particular, he wants to know, why did this war come about? Why did it happen? What caused this war to take place? Now, for Herodotus, the word historiai gives us our word history, and the word historia, in the singular, historiai in the plural, in Greek can simply mean story. Any story we would tell a child, any story that we might read in the newspaper today could simply mean story. But it can have some other registers of meaning. For Herodotus, it meant researches, investigations. So right away that tells us something about history, that it's an investigation. It's not merely telling a story, it's investigating all of those things that would go into the story. Herodotus took something of a dramatist view of his task. Now the dramatists, excuse me, you may recall from our earlier discussion, would take particular incidents, particular scenes, particular moments, particular characters, build a wonderful and interesting story around them, and then extract large realms of meaning from that event. In other words, dramatists did not actually tell stories. They didn't narrate a story from beginning to end. A dramatic or a narrative a narrative presentation of their account was not what they were striving for. There is something of that in Herodotus. Now, he is a narrator, and a very good one, but he also fixes on moments, on scenes, on events, and he does it with a dramatist's flair. So what does he want to know? Well, just as in every Greek play, there is the climax. There is the moment when you've got up to the top and you're going to come back down, when everything turns, when everything changes. So for Herodotus, he's got to find, as it were, the climax. where's it going to be? In other words, why did this war happen? Well, he recognized that there could be any number of very long-term trends, but there also has to be some immediate trigger mechanism. I said, he is putting ideals on parade. He's looking for character. And I'll come back in just a second to what those large character trends were as Herodotus saw them. But for the moment, the point I want to make, the point that Herodotus makes, is that given these long-term character trends, such a war could have happened at any time. But it didn't happen at any time. It happened at a particular time. So why then? Well, after Herodotus thought about this for a long time, he said it was all because of the Lydians. Remember our Lydian friends, Croesus, he of the heaping up coins, he of the wealthy person? Got to tell you a little about Greek oracles in order to explain this whole business with Croesus and Herodotus and so on. Oracles were places in the Greek world, temples usually, where there was a seer, a person who could see into the future, a person who could tell you hidden truths. And when people wanted to know something about the future, they would send to one or another of these oracles and they would ask a question. They usually got an answer that came in the form of a riddle. One thinks that the oracles were in the business of hedging their bets. Didn't want to run off the customers by being wrong too often. But anyway, they would get an answer in the form of a riddle, you see. Croesus of Lydia was an ambitious fellow. So he sends off to the oracle of Apollo over on the Ionian coast. And he asks the question, what would happen if I were to attack the Persians? The answer came back from the oracle, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus said, oh boy, he attacked the Persians. And sure enough, he destroyed his empire. Not what he had in mind. But in any case, from Herodotus' point of view, when Croesus somewhat rashly attacked the Persians, that brought the Persians into Anatolia. Once the Persians came into Anatolia, they marched right on to Ionia. They conquered western Anatolia. They conquered the Aegean coast. They conquered a world where lots of Greeks lived. And eventually, large numbers of those Greeks were unwilling to live under foreign domination. They revolted against Persia. Various cities on the mainland lent more or less success. Athens actually lent more success to the Ionian revolt than anyone else did. The Persians then came to feel, once they had suppressed the Ionian revolt, that they had to square accounts with the Greeks on the mainland. And so in two great campaigns, one in 490 BC and one in 480 BC, the Persians sent their massed military might against the Greeks. And the Greeks finally struck them down, beat them off, won the war. So for Herodotus, the Persian War, the battle you see between the Greeks and the Persians, was actually occasioned by Croesus of Lydia's rashness in the first place. There was the trigger mechanism. All right. Fair enough. So that's how he builds his story. That's how it has this dramatic moment in it. And it's plausible. Most historians today would probably say, well, gee, there's more to it than that. But Herodotus' account is plausible. It commands respect. What we can say is that it serves Herodotus to open his big themes. What are these? The arrogance of great states. States that do not bear their capacity to rule with grace and elegance and dignity, but want to throw their weight around. The Persians just thought they had to show the Greeks something. They had to prove the Greeks something. The Greeks were really no threat to the Persians, could have been left alone. More interestingly, and I think somewhat richer food for thought, Herodotus saw an inevitable clash between East and West. All of his great travels led him to believe that world over there is not like our world over here. And these two worlds are not going to live in peace with one another. One suspects that for 2,500 years, the unfolding course of history suggests that Herodotus may have been more right than wrong. And one suspects that only if that changes are we likely to have a very bright future. Herodotus also saw people in the Persian Empire as subjects, as virtual slaves to a great king, and not as free men as he imagined the Greeks to be. So another of his great themes was the inevitable struggle of freedom and tyranny. And his belief was, free men fight for things which they value. Slaves fight for nothing. And therefore, free men will defeat slaves on every occasion. So, Herodotus collects enormous amounts of information, true. Herodotus has a sense that there are proximate and distant events driving historical forces, true. But in the end, he has this large sense of the great issues of history. His younger contemporary, Thucydides, born 460 to 455 BC, dies in 400, knew and admired the work of Herodotus. He even borrowed bits of it in the earliest section of his own work. But he put the writing of history onto a very new path. He wrote of the Peloponnesian Wars. Now, this is the great war between the Peloponnesian League, Sparta and her allies, and the Athenian Empire, Athens and her subjects, that began in 431 BC and carried on intermittently with sort of one end in 411, another in 401, and finally spent itself in the year 400. Thucydides begins his account of this war in good Herodotean fashion back in the 450s. He's really trying to narrate, how did this whole thing come about in the first place? How did we get ourselves into this fix? And he thought, well, we've got to go back in time. We have to understand the antecedents of the war. His account, alas, stops abruptly in the year 411. He just didn't finish it. We wish very much that he did. He himself was, again, a highly educated, a widely read person. He was also briefly a general during the Peloponnesian War. So he had the experience, really, of kind of hands-on participation in the life of Athens at this decisive time. So, even though Thucydides' work is incomplete, and as far as we can tell is unrevised, he doesn't seem to have been able to go back and kind of polish it up and tidy it up in the way that one would with something with a long work. His basic working methods are clear. His overall views and intentions are clear. We can see from what we have what he was trying to do. His view of the causes of this war. Again, there are, in his view, certain inevitabilities almost to the struggle, but he says that this war came about because Sparta and its allies were inordinately jealous of Athens, and that Sparta's allies stirred Sparta up finally to start the war. Now, we could go back and look through this period and say that there might be plenty of evidence that we could adduce to suggest that the Athenians actually had generated about as much of this contention as the Spartans ever did. Thucydides creates speeches and puts them in people's mouths. He tells us that he does not have to quote exactly what people said. He must tell what they would have said on such an occasion. And he creates remarkable speeches and puts them into people's mouths. And this is his way. And this, again, is a bit like the theater, because the speeches in Thucydides are not wholly unlike the choruses in Greek dramas. The chorus that turns, as it were, to the audience. They don't really turn at all, but it's as if they turn to the audience and say, now, you know what's going on up there, don't you? You know what they're really saying right now, don't you? There's a certain sense in which Thucydides uses his speeches to accomplish the same kind of thing. You see these public arts and how there is even communication among the art forms? Thucydides is cautious about Athens. He's aware of the problems. He's aware of some of the stupid things that were done, of some of the less able leaders that Athens produced, particularly in the time after Pericles. He had great admiration for Pericles. Not much admiration at all for those who came after him. And he felt, basically, that the glories of Periclean Athens were worth plunging into war and were worth all the other costs that Athens had paid to have this brief moment. His funeral oration is his great statement about Athens. Now, at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, it was common for the leading public citizen in Athens, Pericles was the person that time, the head of the board of 10 generals, to deliver a public eulogy over those who had died in the previous year's campaigning. Normally, a person on such an occasion would give a speech full of pious platitudes about these nice boys who had lost their lives, sit down and be quiet. Pericles got up in Thucydides' telling and praised Athens. He praised that for which the boys had died. He spoke of Athens as a school of Hellas. He said, everyone admires us, everyone emulates us, the whole world comes to us, not to other places. Here he says there is a spirit of freedom and openness in inquiry. It's an interesting and remarkable move. And insofar as Thucydides already told us that he's inventing speeches, except insofar as what people would have said, he could have put any words he wanted to in Pericles' mouth. But what he puts into Pericles' mouth is this remarkable speech in favor of Athens, in favor of the cause for which these young men had died. Is Thucydides then somehow a kind of an unvarnished claque for Athens? Is he sort of Athens' great public relations agency? No, not at all. If we call Herodotus the father of history, we call Thucydides the father of scientific history. There is something cool, cold almost, rational, calculating, detached about the way Thucydides can describe what happened in the course of this war. He recognized that war can generate perhaps the greatest stresses of any large-scale process through which a society can go. It can make its citizens savage. It can render the quality of public life coarse. It can make leaders do odd and unpredictable things. His account, for example, of the Mytilene affair is one particularly vivid example of this. Now, the island of Mytilene was over in the Aegean, over near the coast of Ionia. It had long been part of the Athenian Empire. And the Mytileneans wanted to withdraw their allegiance. The Athenian assembly met and had a vote. One of the popular demagogues got up and said, all right, that's it. Let's kill all the men and we will enslave the women and children. They sent the fleet to execute the charge. The next day, the assembly meets again. Somebody comes in. Cooler heads prevail. They say, oh, my heavens, we can't do that. They send a ship to catch the fleet. The ship actually catches the fleet just in the nick of time. And the Mytileneans are spared. But this is Thucydides' way of saying, you know, there's wonderful things about Athens, but look, there's this too. He was subject, Thucydides was, to many of the influences of his time. Like Herodotus, for example, he was very much influenced by the dramatists. There is a very powerful dramatic element in Thucydides in the way he structures his account. But there is also much in Thucydides that is dramatic, for instance, in his use of deliberately archaic language. How often do we see writers use archaic language to add a sort of an element of a hint of authenticity, you see, to what they write? The medical writers taught him a great deal. This is the time of Hippocrates, the first of the great medical writers. They taught him about analysis, about etiology, progress, and diagnosis. There is something profoundly medical about the way Thucydides examines the Athenian body politic. The sophists, and we'll hear much more about the sophists in our very next lecture when we turn to Greek philosophy, they taught him about the power of rhetoric, the power of language to influence people, the power of language to prevail, the power of language to trump absolute truth, to trump justice. The Melian dialogue is his famous example of this. The island of Melos lays off the coast of the Peloponnesus, had always been independent, utterly neutral, the Switzerland of Greece. The Athenians went to Melos and said, you must join our empire. The Melians said, thank you very much, we've always been neutral, we're not going to join your empire. The Athenians said, well, actually you are, or else we'll kill you all, and enslave the ones we don't kill. The Melians said, that's unjust. The Athenians said, justice has nothing to do with it. We have the power to make you do this. And since we have the power, we have the right to use it. The Melian says, where's the justice in that? And the Athenians say, might makes right. There's no good evidence that Thucydides believed that at all. But he knew that that was one of the great currents in the Athens of his day. And he laid it out that way for people to see it. Now, there were other historical writers later in the Greek world, Xenophon, for example, a prolific writer. He continued Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. He wrote a history of Greece in the latter part of in the first part of the 4th century BC. He wrote a book, sort of a how-to manual for a Persian king. He wrote an account of a Greek mercenary army in Persia. Some have said Xenophon was more almost journalist than historian. He was not the literary artist that Herodotus or Thucydides were. and he didn't have the same elevated sense of fundamental principles and fundamental ideals. But he carried on and extended the Greek historical tradition. And so what we can see in the best of these Greek historians is people engaged with the world of their day, engaged with the art forms of their day, engaged with the great intellectual issues of their day, speaking to their contemporaries, yes, and speaking to the future as well, to us. One final context, then, that we must sketch is that of Greek philosophy. And we'll turn to that in our next two lectures.